Hey everyone, welcome back. You know we love to geek out about making Kubernetes work smoothly, and today we're diving into something really cool.
Yeah, this is exciting stuff.
We're talking ArgoCD and Crossplane, how they team up with Amazon EKS for managing a whole bunch of Kubernetes clusters.
All from one place?
Exactly. And to make sure we get it right, we're looking at this document all about using them with an EKS management cluster.
Yes, that's the key, a management cluster.
So maybe start by explaining that. What's the big deal with a management cluster?
Okay, so think of it this way. It's like having a central control tower for all your Kubernetes clusters.
Oh, I see. So instead of managing each cluster separately,
Exactly. You can manage not just your apps, but also the infrastructure they run on.
from this one central place.
You got it.
That's pretty powerful, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, it streamlines a lot of things.
So this management cluster, we're building it on EKS. That's Amazon's Kubernetes service.
Right. It gives us a really solid and scalable base.
So we get all the AWS goodness combined with the flexibility of Kubernetes.
Yeah, it's the best of both worlds.
I like the sound of that. But then we add ArgoCD and Crossplane into the mix.
That's where the real magic happens.
Tell me more. What makes them so special?
Well, let's start with ArgoCD.
Okay, ArgoCD, hit me.
Think of it as our GitOps superhero.
GitOps, that's managing everything through our code repository, right?
Exactly. ArgoCD constantly monitors your code repo and automatically deploys any changes to your clusters.
So no more manual deployments, yay.
No more inconsistencies between environments either.
Dev, test, production, all in sync.
Perfectly in sync.
This sounds almost too good to be true. So I push a code change, and ArgoCD handles everything else.
It's the beauty of automation. But it gets even better.
Okay, there's more. I'm all ears.
Because it's all driven by Git, you have a complete audit trail of every single change.
So troubleshooting and rollbacks are easy.
Super easy. You know exactly what changed and when.
I see the appeal. Big time. But we've talked about apps. What about the actual infrastructure? You know, the servers, the storage.
That's where Crossplane swoops in.
Crossplane, our infrastructure hero.
It lets you manage all your cloud infrastructure using the same declarative approach you use for your applications in Kubernetes.
Wait, hold on. I can write Kubernetes YAML files to define my AWS infrastructure.
You got it.
No more jumping between tools and consoles.
Crossplane makes it all feel like an extension of your Kubernetes workflows.
My mind is blown. This is really cool. But what about drift? You know, someone accidentally, or maybe not so accidentally, makes changes directly in the AWS console, messing up our config.
Drift, the eternal enemy. But Crossplane has a secret weapon.
Oh, tell me more.
Continuous drift detection and reconciliation.
Okay, big words. Break it down for me.
It's like having a guardian constantly watching over your infrastructure,
Making sure no one messes things up.
ensuring that any manual changes are automatically corrected to match what you defined in your code.
So even if someone goes rogue and tries to change something in AWS directly,
Crossplane will swoop in and revert it.
okay, now that is impressive. I'm really starting to see the value here.
It's all about keeping things consistent and predictable.
So let's recap. We've got EKS as our base, ArgoCD for apps, and Crossplane for infrastructure.
All working together in perfect harmony.
It sounds like this trio could really be a game changer for managing all this Kubernetes stuff.
It's about embracing GitOps and extending Kubernetes to cover not just apps, but your whole cloud setup.
We're talking automation, consistency, and resilience all in one package.
Exactly.
I'm sold. But let's talk about the initial setup. Building this management cluster might seem intimidating. Where do we even begin?
Don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds. Our source recommends using Terraform for the initial provisioning of the EKS cluster.
Terraform, the infrastructure as code classic, I'm familiar with that.
It lets us define things like our VPC, subnets, security groups, the core stuff.
But doesn't using Terraform mean we risk drift during setup?
That's a valid point, but we can minimize that risk.
Okay, how so?
We'll use Terraform just for bootstrapping the EKS cluster, setting up that initial foundation.
And then we hand over the reins to ArgoCD and Crossplane for the ongoing management.
Exactly. That way we keep our infrastructure clean and maintainable and minimize drift once things are up and running.
So Terraform lays the groundwork, then ArgoCD and Crossplane take over to keep things running smoothly.
You got it. A well-coordinated relay race.
I like that analogy. So now that we have the foundation, how do we actually deploy ArgoCD and Crossplane? I'm eager to see how these tools work in practice.
Great question. Let's start with ArgoCD. Our source highlights the use of Helm, the package manager for Kubernetes.
Helm makes sense. It's like an app store for Kubernetes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes deploying ArgoCD incredibly easy, just a few commands and you're good to go.
So we can use Terraform to take care of that initial release, or we can deploy it manually using Helm. Either way, it sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. And once ArgoCD is up and running, we just need to tell it which Git repositories to monitor and how to deploy those Kubernetes manifests.
And from then on, ArgoCD is our automation engine, keeping our applications in sync with our code.
It's the beauty of GitOps. Everything is driven by the code, a single source of truth for our entire infrastructure.
Now let's talk about Crossplane. Is the deployment process similar to ArgoCD?
Very similar. We can use Helm or even just plain Kubernetes manifests to get it up and running.
Okay, and then once Crossplane is installed, that's when we start defining our desired infrastructure using those custom resources, the XRDs you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It's like writing blueprints for our cloud environment, but using the language of Kubernetes.
We define what we want, and Crossplane makes it happen in AWS.
And it keeps making sure it happens,
Right.
continuously reconciling those resources.
Ensuring they always match what we define in our XRDs, right?
You got it. It's like having a self-healing infrastructure, constantly adapting to our blueprints.
This is incredible. Can we walk through an example of how this actually works?
Absolutely. Remember that scenario where someone accidentally terminates an EC2 instance?
Oh yeah, a classic cloud disaster waiting to happen.
Without Crossplane, it could be a major headache to fix.
But with Crossplane, we don't even break a sweat.
As soon as Crossplane detects that the instance is gone, it automatically recreates it.
And our infrastructure is back to its intended state as if nothing ever happened.
Exactly. That's the peace of mind that Crossplane provides.
So instead of panicking, we can focus on building cool apps, knowing that our infrastructure is safe and sound.
You got it. That's the power of this approach.
This has been an eye-opening conversation. It feels like we're on the verge of a real paradigm shift in how we manage infrastructure.
It's all about moving away from manual tasks and embracing automation and declarative configurations.
We're treating our infrastructure with the same level of care and precision as we treat our code.
And that's a good thing.
I'm totally on board with that.
Yeah.
But before we dive even deeper into the specifics of these tools, let's address the elephant in the room, security. We're talking about managing our entire Kubernetes world from this one central point. That sounds like a big responsibility.
You're absolutely right. Security is paramount.
So how do we make sure our management cluster is locked down tight?
Well, we need to apply all the best practices. Role-based access control, network segmentation, encryption, the works.
We can't let any unauthorized access slip through the cracks.
Absolutely not. This is the heart of our operation. It needs to be Fort Knox.
I like that analogy. So we're using strong security measures to protect the management cluster itself.
Yes, and we also need to consider how we're managing credentials and secrets for connecting to our other clusters.
Ah, that's a good point. We can't just store those in plain text somewhere.
Definitely not. We need a secure way to store and rotate those secrets, maybe using a dedicated secret management tool.
That makes sense. We need to be extra careful with those sensitive bits of information.
Absolutely. And while we're talking security, we should also consider how we're managing updates and patches for our management cluster.
Right. We don't want to leave any known vulnerabilities exposed.
We need to establish a solid process for keeping everything up to date.
Maybe even automate that process so we don't have to rely on manual interventions.
That's the ideal scenario. Automation helps reduce the risk of human error.
This is all starting to sound like a lot to manage. Are there any tools or frameworks that can help us with all of this?
Absolutely. There are tons of resources available in the Kubernetes ecosystem to help with security and automation.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, for secret management, you could look into tools like HashiCorp Vault or Kubernetes Secret Store CSI driver.
Okay. Those sound familiar. I've heard good things about them.
And for managing updates and patches, there are tools like Cured or even just using a GitOps approach with ArgoCD to automatically apply updates.
It's amazing how much the Kubernetes community has already done to address these challenges.
It's a testament to the collaborative spirit of the open source world.
I'm feeling more confident now, knowing that we have all these resources at our disposal.
It's all about finding the right combination of tools and practices that work for your specific needs.
It's like assembling a team of superheroes, each with their own unique powers, to help us secure and automate our entire Kubernetes infrastructure.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. But remember, even with all these tools, security is an ongoing process.
We can't just set it and forget it.
We need to stay vigilant, keep learning, and adapt to new threats as they emerge.
So it's not just about building a secure management cluster, it's about building a security-conscious culture within our organization.
Exactly. Security is everyone's responsibility.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface.
We've laid a good foundation, though.
Before we move on, is there anything else we need to consider when setting up this management cluster?
One thing that comes to mind is resource management.
Oh, yeah, that's important. We need to make sure our management cluster has enough resources to handle all the other clusters it's managing.
Exactly. We need to think about CPU, memory, storage, all of that good stuff.
And make sure we're allocating those resources appropriately.
Right. And also think about scalability. Can our management cluster grow as we add more applications and clusters?
So it's not just about the initial setup, it's about planning for the future.
Exactly. We need to build a system that can evolve and adapt to our changing needs.
This is all starting to sound like a pretty complex undertaking.
It can be, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
I'm up for the challenge. I'm eager to see how all of this comes together in practice.
Me too. I think we're ready to dive into the next level of detail.
Let's do it. All right, so we're back, and we've been talking about all the cool things you can do with EKS, ArgoCD, and Crossplane.
Right. It's a powerful combination.
Before the break, we were deep diving into Crossplane and how it lets us manage cloud resources right from Kubernetes.
It's really slick.
You mentioned these custom resources and XRDs.
Yeah, the XRDs are really the heart of Crossplane.
Could you unpack those a bit more, maybe in plain English, for those just tuning in?
Sure. So basically, think of Crossplane's XRDs, that's composite resource definitions, as like blueprints for your cloud infrastructure.
Blueprints, that's a good analogy.
You use them to define the specs for things like AWS S3 buckets.
Like the name, region, access controls, all that jazz.
Exactly. Any setting you can configure for that resource, you put in the XRD.
So it's like writing code, but instead of application logic, we're defining our cloud setup.
You got it. Infrastructure as code, but living right inside our Kubernetes world.
That's so cool. It's like everything is coming together in one place.
It's all about consistency and using what you already know from Kubernetes.
Makes sense. So we define our XRDs, these blueprints, but how do we actually make AWS create those resources? Do we still have to go click around on the console?
Nope, that's the beauty of it. Crossplane handles that for you.
No more manual clicking. I love it.
Once you've created that XRD and applied it to your cluster, Crossplane takes over.
It talks to AWS behind the scenes.
It provisions those resources in AWS
Yeah.
based on exactly what you defined in the XRD.
So I just say, I want an S3 bucket in my Kubernetes YAML, and boom, it appears in AWS.
Pretty much. That's the power of Crossplane's reconciliation engine.
Reconciliation, that's a fancy word.
It basically means it's constantly comparing what you defined in your XRDs.
With what's actually running in AWS.
Exactly. And if something's different, like someone messed with settings manually,
Crossplane jumps in and fixes it.
it automatically makes things right, keeps everything in sync.
This is how it tackles that whole drift problem we were talking about.
Boy, that's one of its superpowers.
It's like having a robot constantly checking and fixing things.
Makes managing infrastructure much less stressful.
Definitely. Remember that example we talked about? Someone accidentally messing with the permissions on an S3 bucket?
Oh yeah, that could lead to some serious security issues.
But with Crossplane, no worries, it would detect that change.
And revert it back to the secure configuration we defined.
Our own automated security guard.
Always on duty. And it's all driven by those Kubernetes configurations.
We just define the rules. Crossplane enforces them.
Exactly. No more worrying about manual mistakes or inconsistencies.
This is fantastic. So we've talked about Crossplane and how it handles infrastructure.
It makes it so much easier.
But where does ArgoCD fit into all of this? We said it's our GitOps champion, right?
Right. And they work together beautifully in a GitOps workflow.
They're like a dynamic duo working in perfect harmony.
ArgoCD handles deploying your applications and any Kubernetes resources they need.
And Crossplane takes care of the underlying cloud infrastructure.
They keep your whole tech stack in sync with what you defined in your code.
It's like a perfectly choreographed dance.
Let's say you're deploying a new microservice that needs, I don't know, an S3 bucket for storage.
Okay, common scenario.
You would define your application deployment in your Kubernetes YAML files.
And the S3 bucket configuration would go in a Crossplane XRD.
Right, and then you commit both of those to your Git repository.
And ArgoCD sees those changes and takes it from there.
It automatically deploys that new microservice to your Kubernetes cluster.
While Crossplane is busy creating the S3 bucket over in AWS.
Everything happens automatically, in sync, based on that one code commit.
That's GitOps in action. Beautiful. And what are the big wins here? What do we gain from all this automation?
Well, first of all, less risk.
Less chance of human error messing things up.
Exactly. And then there's the audit trail.
Everything is traceable back to a specific commit in our Git repo.
You know exactly who changed what and when.
Makes troubleshooting so much easier.
And rollbacks, too, if something goes wrong.
It's like having a time machine for your entire infrastructure.
Plus, it makes things way more efficient, no more manual back and forth.
Developers can focus on building apps knowing that the infrastructure will just work.
It's a win-win all around.
I love this. We've covered a lot of ground here, from management clusters to XRDs and GitOps workflows.
It's a lot to take in.
But before we get too far ahead, I want to circle back to something we briefly mentioned.
Sure, what's that?
Terraform, using it for the initial EKS cluster setup.
Ah, yes, that's an important part.
Could we walk through that a bit more? Why Terraform and how does it fit in?
So, while Crossplane is fantastic for managing cloud resources once you're inside Kubernetes, Terraform is still really good for setting up the EKS cluster itself.
Because Terraform lets us define things like our VPC, subnets, those core AWS components.
Using that familiar declarative approach, writing code to describe our infrastructure.
So Terraform gets us started, sets up the foundation.
And then we hand over the reins to Crossplane and ArgoCD for the ongoing management.
Kind of like a relay race. Each tool plays its part.
Exactly. Keeps things clean, organized, and easier to maintain.
I like that. It's like a well-coordinated team effort.
So, to summarize, Terraform for the initial EKS cluster, and then Crossplane and ArgoCD for managing everything running on top of it.
Apps, infrastructure, the whole 9 yards.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the right job.
Makes sense. This has been incredibly insightful, and I'm starting to really grasp the power of this approach.
It's a game changer for sure.
What stands out to you as the most impressive aspect? For me, it's the level of automation and control we can achieve.
Yeah, that's huge.
Huh.
Makes managing Kubernetes so much easier.
It's like we're conducting an orchestra, making sure everything is in harmony.
Instead of herding cats like it used to feel.
Exactly. But before everyone runs off to build their own management clusters,
Hold your horses.
are there any gotchas we should be aware of? Any advice for those just getting started?
Oh, definitely. First off, you got to plan carefully.
Plan our attack.
Think about the structure and layout of your management cluster, how you'll handle security, scaling, all those important considerations.
Because this is the heart of our operation, it needs to be rock solid.
Right. It's not just about deploying tools. It's about building a solid foundation.
Makes sense. What else should we keep in mind?
Security obviously can't stress that enough.
Lock it down tight.
Your management cluster is the key to your whole kingdom. You got to protect it.
Role-based access control, network policies, encryption, everything we can throw at it.
Exactly. And think about how you'll manage credentials, those secrets for connecting to other clusters.
We need a secure way to handle those. Can't just leave them lying around.
And updates too. How are we going to keep everything patched and secure?
Do we need to manually update all the tools, or can we automate that as well?
Automation is always the goal. Less risk of human error.
It's starting to feel a bit overwhelming, all these things to keep track of.
It can be, but thankfully the Kubernetes community has our back.
There are tools and frameworks that can help us, right?
Tons of them. For secret management, you've got HashiCorp Vault, Kubernetes Secret Stores CSI driver.
And for updates, Cured, ArgoCD can help with that too.
It's amazing how much is already out there ready to use.
It's like having an army of helpers at our disposal.
And the community is always growing. New tools and best practices are emerging all the time.
I'm feeling more confident now knowing that we're not alone in this.
It's all about finding the right combination that works for you.
It's like building our own custom superhero team.
Exactly. But even with all these tools and resources, security is an ongoing process. We can't just set it and forget it.
We need to stay vigilant, always learning and adapting.
Because the bad guys are always coming up with new tricks.
So it's not just about technology, it's about mindset.
It's a security-first culture. Everyone needs to be involved.
Okay, I think we've covered the security angle pretty well.
We've hammered that point home.
But is there anything else we need to consider when setting up this management cluster? Any final words of wisdom?
One thing that often gets overlooked is resource management.
Ah, right. We need to make sure our management cluster has enough horsepower to handle all the other clusters.
CPU, memory, storage, all of that.
And make sure we're allocating those resources efficiently.
And also think about scalability. Can our management cluster grow as our needs grow?
So it's not just about today, it's about tomorrow.
We need a system that can evolve and adapt to our changing demands.
It's like building a house. You don't want to run out of space a year later.
Yeah.
Exactly. Plan for the future. Make sure your foundation is solid.
This is all starting to sound like a pretty complex undertaking.
It can be, but it's also incredibly rewarding.
I'm definitely up for the challenge.
Yeah.
I'm eager to see how all this comes together in practice,
Me too. I think we're ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive.
where we'll tie everything together and see the big picture.
It's going to be epic.
Welcome back. We've covered a ton of ground about managing Kubernetes infrastructure with EKS, ArgoCD, and Crossplane.
It's a lot, but hopefully it's all starting to click.
We saw how powerful this trio can be, but let's zoom out. Look at the big picture.
All right, big picture time.
What does this all mean for someone actually using these tools in their day-to-day work?
The key takeaway here is you're enabling a true GitOps workflow.
GitOps, right, we touched on that, managing everything through code.
Exactly. With this setup, every change you make, whether it's to your app or the infrastructure it runs on,
It all starts with a simple code commit.
that's the trigger. That commit sets off a whole chain of automated actions, ensuring everything stays in sync no matter what.
It's like a domino effect, but in a really good way.
I like that. So less manual work, more automation, that's got to be a good thing, right?
Tons of benefits. First off, you dramatically reduce risk,
Less room for human error, which is always a good thing.
especially when dealing with complex systems.
No more late night panics because someone accidentally deleted a server.
Exactly. And on top of that, auditing becomes a breeze.
Auditing, right, keeping track of who changed what.
Every change trace back to a specific commit in your Git history.
Crystal clear accountability, which is crucial these days.
For security, compliance, you name it.
This all sounds amazing, but I gotta ask, what about the learning curve?
That's a fair question. These tools are powerful, no doubt.
They require some investment to really master.
There's definitely a learning curve involved.
But hey, anything worth doing takes effort, right?
And the payoff here is huge.
Yeah.
Once you get over that initial hump,
You unlock a level of efficiency and control that was previously unimaginable. I guess it's like learning a new language. It takes time, but once you're fluent...
you can express yourself in ways you never thought possible.
Exactly. So, out of all of this, what's the most compelling part for you?
For me, it's how it simplifies tasks that used to be incredibly complex.
Like what? Give me an example.
Imagine never having to worry about someone accidentally deleting a crucial cloud resource.
Okay, I can definitely relate to that fear.
With Crossplane, that's not an issue anymore. It constantly ensures your infrastructure matches what you defined in your code.
It's like having a safety net, catching you before you fall.
It's peace of mind. You can sleep soundly knowing that Crossplane has your back.
That's a great feeling. And it's not just Crossplane, it's the whole system working together.
EKS providing that solid base, ArgoCD handling application deployments, and then Crossplane taking care of the infrastructure.
It all fits together so well.
It's elegant, it's powerful, and it's changing the way we manage cloud-native systems.
Well said. But before we send everyone off to go build their Kubernetes empires.
World domination, one cluster at a time.
Almost. But seriously, any final words of advice for those ready to take the plunge?
My biggest piece of advice, don't be afraid to jump in and get your hands dirty.
Experiment, break things, learn from your mistakes.
The Kubernetes community is incredibly supportive. There are tons of resources out there to help you.
Blogs, forums, meetups, conferences, you name it.
And don't be shy about asking for help. Everyone starts somewhere.
We're all in this together, figuring things out as we go.
And most importantly, have fun. Building and managing Kubernetes can be a blast.
I agree, it's challenging, but also incredibly rewarding.
So there you have it, folks. That's our deep dive into taming cloud chaos.
Using the power of EKS, ArgoCD, and Crossplane,
We covered a lot, from the basics of management clusters to advanced security and automation techniques.
hopefully you're feeling inspired and ready to take your Kubernetes skills to the next level.
Go forth and build amazing things.
And until next time, happy coding!